Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Protecting Wetlands and Streams in Your Community. Tonight's webinar is part of a series of educational sessions brought to us by the Hudson River Estuary Program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. This particular session is a tri-county endeavor between Orange, Sullivan, and Rockland counties. My name is Adam Carson. I am a planner in the Land Use Division at the Rockland County Planning Department. Also contributing to make tonight happen, we have Stephen Stewart from the Sullivan County Office of Sustainable Energy, Heather Jaxie and Cassandra Johnstone from the Sullivan County Division of Planning, Community Development, and Environmental Management, and Kate Schmidt from the Orange County Department of Planning. A couple very quick housekeeping notes. The slides from tonight will be available as a PDF. Please email a request if you'd like a copy. Regarding training hours for board members, all attendees will get an automated email tomorrow that you can forward to your board clerk if your municipality accepts those types of automatic emails. If not, contact your respective county planning department for a confirmation. Anyone in Rockland County on a land use board member, I have your information and I will update the Federation's database. Tonight's session is about wetlands, and just very briefly, we're here to learn why they're important, what rules and regulations exist around them, and what you can do on a local level to help protect them. Helping us with that tonight, we have Ingrid Haeckel and attorney Emily Svenson. Ingrid is a conservation and land use specialist with the DEC's Hudson River Estuary Program through a partnership with Cornell University. For the past 10 years, she has provided education and technical assistance to municipal and regional partners to promote conservation of important natural areas in the Hudson Valley. Haeckel has just been promoted to the Hudson River Estuary Program Manager at DEC, effective later next week. Congratulations. Where she will oversee all aspects of the program's interdisciplinary scientific research and outreach on water resource conservation, climate resilience, and conservation in the estuary watershed. She has a BA in environmental biology from Columbia University and an MA in geography from the University of Texas at Austin. Emily Svenson is a partner in the law firm Gordon and Svenson LLP in Poughkeepsie. Her legal practice focuses on environmental, land use, municipal law, assisting citizen groups and nonprofits advocating for environmental protection, as well as working with municipalities to develop land use policy. Svenson began her career in soil and water conservation and served as coordinator of the Lower Hudson Coalition of Conservation Districts, focusing on stormwater education. Svenson lives in Hyde Park and has experience serving as an elected town board member and deputy supervisor. She currently volunteers as vice president of the Hudson River Watershed Alliance, a technical advisor to the Hudson River Drinking Water Intermunicipal Council, and a member of the Hudson River Estuary Management Advisory Council. She has a BS in Environmental Science from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and a JD from Pace Law School. And with that, I will turn it over to Emily and Ingrid. And I believe we will hold questions until the end, as the questions that tend to arise are sometimes answered throughout the session. So please, Ingrid, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Adam. Slide looks good right now. You're seeing everything?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to the Rockland County Municipal Planning Federation for hosting this webinar, as well as to Orange and Sullivan County Planning Departments for co-sponsoring the program. My name is Ingrid Haeckel, and I'll be presenting together with Emily Svenson about protecting wetlands and streams in your community. There we go. So I'll be starting off the session with a brief introduction to the importance of wetlands and streams, including diversity, mapping, benefits, and some threats. And Emily will take it from there to discuss the changing status of federal and state regulation of these resources, as well as local approaches to wetland and stream protection. And lastly, I'll finish up with some additional information on more training, tools, and funding available to develop local policy. So some of the messages we hope you'll take home are that wetland and stream protection, including adjacent buffer areas, is really vital to clean water and many other benefits these areas provide. Our existing maps of wetlands and streams are incomplete, and they don't provide a reliable picture of all of the resources that are out there. So you should do your homework and look more closely when you're reviewing projects. And state and federal regulations are changing, and they leave some big gaps. But fortunately, municipalities can do more, and there are many different approaches. And lastly, you can make a difference as a municipal board member in the way that you're reviewing projects and the questions you ask. Even if your community doesn't have additional local regulation, there are ways that you can be an advocate for the conservation of these resources. Oops. So before we start, the Hudson River Estuary Program is a special program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation established to help people enjoy, protect, and revitalize the Hudson River and its watershed. And we work to achieve many key benefits shown here. And we offer assistance and funding to municipalities that are interested in better protecting their water. So you can reach out to me if you are interested in discussing anything we cover tonight further. And as we begin, I'd like to take a moment and ask you to think about a wetland or a stream near you. It could be one that you see regularly in your neighborhood or driving through town, perhaps one on your property. And as we go through the presentation, you can think about what type of wetland or stream it is, the benefits it provides, and whether and how it may be protected at the federal, state, and local level. So this is a stream near and dear to my heart. I grew up along this stream in Western Massachusetts, and it really influenced my career path. And it's a great example of how this patchwork of protection really varies from place to place. The stream originates in New York State, and it's classified as a trout stream, so it does have some protection under the state laws, which Emily will be discussing in the presentation. But there's no buffer protection in New York State. One of the communities it flows through has enacted some additional stormwater regulations in a buffer along this stream. But when it flows into Massachusetts, there's a much bigger, like a 200-foot regulated buffer area along this type of stream. So the regulation varies, but the resource doesn't know those boundaries, of course. And so these are important features that cross political boundaries, and ideally we should be thinking about a more coordinated approach to protect our streams and rivers and wetlands. So let's start with some definitions. A stream is simply a natural waterway flowing in a visible channel with defined bed and banks. So generally we call large streams rivers, and it's important to note that streams are dynamic. They interact closely with adjacent areas and floodplains. The floodplains are low-lying areas along streams that periodically flood after heavy rainfall and snowmelt events. These are important parts of the stream system, and even though they're dry most of the time, we should be considering them as part of the stream. The riparian area, oopsie, I'm sorry, this is skipping around. So the riparian area is the land bordering the stream or water body, and that is influenced by the presence of nearby surface and groundwater. And these are areas where groundwater is usually very shallow to the surface. Therefore, there's vegetation, and the vegetation and the land uses in these areas have a strong influence on the hydrology and water quality in the nearby stream. And the third term here that I'll touch on is riparian buffer. So a riparian buffer is, or a stream buffer is a protective area of vegetation between the water body and human activity. And this same concept applies to wetland buffers. There are many different types of streams, but we're going to focus in this presentation on the basic distinction between perennial versus intermittent streams. A perennial stream flows year-round, whereas intermittent streams only flow seasonally or after a heavy rainfall. Nevertheless, intermittent streams contribute significantly to the quantity and quality of water in downstream rivers and water bodies. So you may also hear the term ephemeral stream pop up in this presentation, and those are very small streams that only flow after a rain event. The EPA estimates that intermittent streams comprise nearly 60% of total stream length in the United States. However, in many cases, intermittent streams are unmapped. This is a map showing streams in Woodstock, New York. Woodstock happens to have high resolution local stream mapping that distinguishes perennial streams, which are shown in blue here, versus intermittent streams shown in purple. And none of the intermittent streams shown on this map appear on state or federal stream maps, but they account for 67% of the stream length in this area. So I'll move on to wetlands. And again, with some definitions, wetlands have three main characteristics in common, being hydrology, soils, and vegetation. So in a wetland, water is present at or near the ground surface for a sufficient period of time during the growing season to result in the development of special soil conditions known as hydric soils, and vegetation adapted to growing in those saturated soils, like the skunk cabbage shown on this slide. Oopsie. So wetlands are really diverse. Truly, no two wetlands are alike, but we do have some general categories of wetlands, and I've put up some of the main ones here. Not all wetlands are wet all the time. This is one of the main messages to take away with wetlands if you haven't worked with wetlands before. As a result, we have wetlands that are dry for part of the year. Many of those types of wetlands can be missed by the mapping that we have, even though they have the same saturated soils and vegetation development as other wetter wetlands. In addition, in our estuary watershed, the tidal Hudson is influenced by daily tidal fluctuations, and we have very unique tidal wetlands along the Hudson. We're not going to talk about those in this presentation, but you may have those in your community as well. Knowing which type of wetland you have or you're looking at can help you to determine the animal species or plant species that might occur there. And I'm going to walk through these types in a little bit more detail on the next slides. So a swamp is a wetland dominated by trees and shrubs. Sometimes you have shrub swamps without a full canopy, but this is still considered a swamp. And despite their popular conception, these are wonderful habitats, really diverse, rich environments. Forested swamps, they tend to have a closed canopy. These ecosystems vary widely in how much flooding or how deep the water might be, how frequent the saturation is. Some swamps have standing water all year round. Others may only have saturated soils for a few weeks of the year, but again, sufficient to develop the wetland conditions. Woodland pools are a subset of what you may have heard of as vernal pools. These are small, isolated, and seasonally flooded wetlands. They lack a connection to a stream, and as a result, they don't have fish populations, and that makes them very important amphibian breeding habitats in many cases for salamanders and frogs. And again, these are often small, and they usually don't show up on our existing wetland maps. Wet meadows are a type of wetland that often occurs in abandoned agricultural areas that are dominated by grasses and forbs. You can see the purple loosestrife kind of in the distance in this photo, which is a common plant that occurs in these habitats, and that's again a good indicator of wet soils. And marshes typically have standing water throughout most of the growing season. They're dominated by vegetation like cattails or common reed. These are like our most common typical, like when you think of a wetland with a duck in it, you're probably thinking of a marsh. And similarly, lastly, we have open water habitats like ponds and lakes, which are again, very obvious types of wetlands. They usually have water present, sometimes very deep, and they can support a wide variety of aquatic vegetation. So similarly to the issues with stream maps that I mentioned, state and federal wetland maps are very incomplete. This is a map showing that same area of Woodstock, and there is a DEC mapped freshwater wetland in the center of this area with its light green check zone. We know those state maps are pretty rough and not very accurate. In addition, there are a couple of other dark green areas. These are wetlands mapped in the National Wetland Inventory, which is data sourced from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But in fact, there are numerous other wetlands present. These are shown in pink. These are identified by local habitat mapping, and in particular, smaller, drier wetlands are frequently unmapped and overlooked. So next I'll talk briefly about the functions and benefits of wetlands and streams. This is a diagram showing an overview of how wetlands work and their relationship with the surrounding landscape. Water enters wetlands often from streams or by runoff, and in some cases from groundwater discharging to the surface. And that water, as it enters the wetland, can slow down and spread out, which results in it being released more slowly downstream, and that reduces erosion and flooding when we have big precipitation events. And in the process, the sediment and nutrients that might be in the water entering the wetland are filtered out. Contaminants that might be present can be broken down by bacteria or taken up in plants. And as a result, the water draining out of wetlands is usually much cleaner than the water that enters them. And for these reasons, they're often called the kidneys of the landscape. Small streams have many similar important functions in terms of nutrient processing. They can really help to effectively process nitrogen and reduce excess nitrogen from reaching our downstream rivers, and leading to impacts like algal blooms. So this diagram shows the hyporheic zone in streams. That's the stream bed, the area below the stream bed where there's sediment and porous area where a lot of this activity occurs. And there's shallow mixing of groundwater and surface water in this area, as well as in the area adjacent to the stream. And so you can imagine in urban environments where streams get buried or might be converted into ditches in some cases, we're losing a lot of these important water quality functions of small streams. And in addition, I'll just note the stream bed provides an important source of groundwater recharge. And that gets missed, so that in urban environments, you have just all this water collected in pipes going like directly downstream to its outlet, and there's no opportunity for groundwater infiltration. An intact network of wetlands and streams provides many significant benefits for flood control. A single acre of floodwater and natural stream corridors and floodplains also provide the space that streams need during floods to spread out and slow down water. And this is increasingly important in our changing climate. As our climate warms, we're not only anticipated to receive more overall precipitation per year, but more of that is occurring in heavy downpour type events, like the one we experienced on July 10th this past summer. And the image here is from Highland Falls. Protecting small wetlands and streams isn't necessarily going to prevent those types of catastrophic events from happening, but it can lessen damage, and avoiding new development in flood-prone areas and along streams and rivers, and protecting wetlands where we can reduce risk to our communities. And it's one of the most cost-effective strategies we have to mitigate flood risk and damage from climate change. Oops. Wetlands and streams also provide critical habitat for many common and imperiled species, and these are just a few examples from New York. About 40% of all plants and animals live or breed in wetlands, and about half of federally threatened and endangered species are wetland dependent, and those numbers are similar for New York. It's important to note that critical habitat extends beyond the wetland or stream itself. Many species move between wetland and upland habitats throughout the year to meet different needs, like the spotted salamander shown here, which lives in the surrounding forest habitat for most of the year and comes to the woodland pool or vernal pool for breeding in the springtime, just for a brief period of time. Um, so in addition, protecting buffers around wetlands helps to protect the integrity of the habitat itself and the quality of the habitat from adjacent land uses. There are many benefits of buffers along streams and wetlands. They help to slow down runoff and reduce erosion, filter nutrients and sediment before they reach the aquatic habitat. They control flooding, they provide shade and that keeps water cool in streams, and they contribute organic matter and wood, which are vital to in-stream habitats or wetland habitats. So you may have heard the term that fish grow on trees because they rely on the shade, food, and habitat that trees provide. So anyone who likes to fish will quickly learn to look for woody structure in a stream, like tree roots, logs, branches, because that's often where you'll find fish. So many people often ask these presentations about how wide of a buffer is necessary to protect these functions. And buffer width really depends on the goal you're trying to achieve. And, in general, the bigger the better. This is a graph showing buffer widths based on scientific literature. So, a buffer of 30 to 100 feet may be sufficient to filter out sediment and remove phosphorus from runoff. But you may need a buffer of up to 160 feet to adequately address nitrogen removal. And for wildlife habitat, you may need a buffer of 100 to 300 or more feet. And in general, however, the literature supports a buffer of at least 100 feet along streams to achieve most of these benefits. So the last thing I'll touch on here are some common threats to these resources, specifically threats related to land use. We know that vegetation clearing, filling, and grading are common plights of small wetlands to make way for new development. And similarly, small streams are often channelized or buried in pipes. Development in wetlands continues to be the leading cause of wetland loss in the Hudson Valley. This is an example of an apartment complex that was partially constructed on top of a wetland in the town where I live. And lastly, excess and polluted runoff from new development can impact nearby streams and wetlands. And we don't have time to go into detail on stormwater management in this program, but it's an important and closely related topic. So with that, Emily, I guess I'll stop sharing and you can put up your slides.
Okay, working on it. Nope, that's not it. There
Great.
we go. Can you see the full screen there?
Looks good.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ingrid, and thanks to the planning departments for hosting, and thanks to all of you for attending and caring about your streams and wetlands. Again, my name is Emily Svenson. I'm an attorney in Poughkeepsie, and I'm going to be talking about first state and federal jurisdiction over streams and wetlands, which is in flux right now. And then also what local governments can do to better protect wetlands in their community. And again, as Ingrid said, there are a lot of different threats to streams and wetlands. We're focusing today on physical disturbance of streams and wetlands during construction and development. And I want to point out that in addition to the slides, there's also a handout that's going to be available, and we'll provide the link to that later. So you'll have all of this information. You don't have to catch it all as it goes by on your screen. So first, just a quick refresher on where laws come from. So as you all know, the state and federal legislatures pass what we call laws or statutes, and then agencies actually take those laws and create regulations to implement the laws to implement the statutes that are passed by the legislature. And then disputes that may arise are resolved by the courts. So I want to kind of put that framework in your mind, because some of the things that are happening right now and why the rules are in flux is because of changes to the statutes and then the regulations that implement those statutes. So I want to make sure we're all starting on the same page. I'm going to start with New York State regulations, because as many of you probably know, they're actually the stronger set of regulations for the most part. Sometimes people think federal sounds important, but the federal regulations on streams and wetlands are, for the most part, not as strong as the state. So we're going to start with the state and start with talking about state regulation of streams. So New York State's regulation of streams is based on mapping, and it's based on the classification of the stream. So there are official maps that show the mapped streams and their classification. And streams that are classified AA, A, B, and C, but only CT or CTS, meaning they're trout streams, those are the ones that are regulated. Streams that are just regular C or D are not regulated by New York State. Again, it's the mapped streams, which are mostly perennial streams. There are a few intermittent streams that are mapped, so all mapped streams are regulated. If you come across an unmapped stream, if it is perennial, it will be regulated and it will take the classification of the stream it flows into. But if it's intermittent, it will not be regulated. So this is an example. You'll see, can you all see my cursor if I move it? Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
So this stream here is classified as CT, a trout stream. And so it is a class C, but because it's a CT, it is regulated by New York State. This other stream over here, perfectly nice stream, looks like it might be in great shape, but that is just a regular C stream, so it is not regulated. So there's, it sometimes seems not a lot of rhyme or reason to it, but that's the way it works. So then within those streams that are regulated, what area is regulated? New York State regulates the bed and the banks of the stream. The bed is the area that's underwater to the mean high water level, and the banks are the adjacent area that slopes toward the stream, generally a maximum of 50 feet from the mean high water level. So the only exception is if it's really steep, if it's greater than a 45-degree slope, then the banks will be considered to go to the break in the slope. But generally, it's just the bed and the banks up to 50 feet. So it's really not a buffer per se. It's just that part of the stream that's the stream bank. So that's the state of New York State regulation of streams. And you don't need to worry about any changes right at the moment because nothing's changing right now. There have been attempts to expand regulation to all Class C streams, not just the C, T, and TS, but that has not been enacted at this point. So, you know, someday maybe, but right now that's where we stand. Just to go back to Ingrid's example from Woodstock, this is the mapped streams that have been mapped by local, by the local government has mapped these streams, but the state jurisdiction only includes the red streams, which are mapped as New York State regulated and jurisdictional. So you'll see that there are a lot of streams that are not included either because they're intermittent or they are Class C or D. Moving on to wetlands. The way New York State regulation of wetlands has worked for quite some time and continues right at today is that the jurisdiction is based on a set of maps, and jurisdiction is based on wetlands that are greater than 12.4 acres in size, as well as some smaller wetlands if they are of unusual local importance. And the state regulates the wetland itself, as well as a 100-foot adjacent area or buffer. So it does include a buffer. And if someone wants to undertake construction in that area, they would need a permit from DEC. So there is a permitting program. It doesn't mean nothing ever could get built in that area. It's a permitting program. But as you may have heard, that is in flux. Things are changing with New York State. So in 2022, the New York State Legislature adopted a change to the statute that will cover more wetlands in the coming years. So state coverage of wetlands is expanding. The regulations are still being developed, and you can look for a comment period in the coming months. You may want to keep an eye out for that. And if you have opinions on how those regulations should be written, you can comment. So the way that the state wrote the change of the statute, it's phasing in over the next several years. So starting in 2025, the jurisdiction will no longer be based on maps. So we're still going to have the 12.4 acre threshold, but it doesn't matter if a wetland is 12.4 acres but not mapped, it will still be jurisdictional starting in 2025. And the other thing that's changing in 2025 is there's new criteria for small wetlands of unusual importance that will become regulated. And some of those criteria are wetlands in an area in a watershed with flooding issues, wetlands in an urban area, if they're habitat for protected species, vernal pools. And also just to note that any wetland that's mapped right now will be included. So even if it turns out it's not 12.4 acres, it will still be considered unusual importance in the 2025 change. But I just want to point out, because that sounds like, oh, great, there's going to be a lot more wetlands regulated. It's still unusual importance. And as Ingrid talked about, wetlands all have, a lot of wetlands have importance that's very usual. It's not unusual. So I don't want folks to think that all these wetlands are suddenly going to be regulated. It's just going to be unusually important ones. Then starting in 2028, the next change that phases in is that the size threshold is going to go down to 7.4 acres. That means that more wetlands will be regulated. Those that are between 7.4 acres and 12.4 acres that are not regulated now will become regulated in 2028. So the state generally expanding its jurisdiction over wetlands. Now we're going to switch to federal jurisdiction. Federal jurisdiction over wetlands is based on the idea of waters of the United States. It's not map-based, so there's no map you can go look at. I do want to emphasize that because sometimes folks think that those national wetland inventory maps are jurisdictional maps. They're not, they're informational maps, but there is no jurisdictional map for federal wetland jurisdiction. There's no minimum size. It can be any size wetland, but the real key is that to be waters of the United States, the wetlands need to be somewhat connected to a stream. The idea there is that federal jurisdiction is based on the Commerce Clause, and so the regulations really extend out through the network of rivers and streams in the country, and anything that's isolated from that is not going to be regulated. So federal jurisdiction includes the wetland itself and no buffer around it, just the actual wetland. And this is really like an important exception here that folks, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, that even if a wetland is jurisdictional under the federal program, there is a lot of permitting available. So there are general permits available that allow disturbance of up to a ½ acre of wetland loss in some cases, just, for the taking, basically. So if small wetlands can be, I don't want people to think that they're protected, quote unquote, just because they're federally jurisdictional. There's still the opportunity for a lot of disturbance to happen under the general permits. So which wetlands does the Clean Water Act apply to? Which wetlands are federally jurisdictional? The key is that they have to be waters of the United States, which is a definition that's been going through a lot of changes. It started out, the navigable waters, rivers, and streams. And then over time, there was the understanding that adjacent wetlands would also be included. But the question is, what is an adjacent wetland? And I'm not going to get into the weeds on that, but there's been a lot of different rules and court cases talking about which wetlands are included in this protection or jurisdiction. And most recently in March 2023, EPA came out finally with a regulation that clearly stated what would be included. And then in May of 2023, the Sackett decision came out from the Supreme Court, and that really changed everything up. So the latest regulation in August 2023, EPA came out with a new regulation that adopts the Supreme Court's definitions of which wetlands are included, which are adjacent to streams. And so the key is that there used to be an idea that wetlands that had some kind of a connection, a significant nexus to the stream, could be included under federal jurisdiction. But the new rule is that that federal jurisdiction includes streams or tributaries that are relatively permanent, standing, or continuously flowing, and adjacent wetlands with a continuous surface connection to those streams. So what that means is that if a wetland, it does not have an actual connection where you can't really tell where the stream ends and the wetland begins, it's not going to be jurisdictional. So isolated wetlands like vernal pools and things are just not going to have any federal jurisdiction. I do want to emphasize these federal changes don't affect New York State's regulations that I just spoke about. New York State has its own laws and its own policies, and that is not being affected by the Supreme Court decision. So kind of the upshot is that the federal regulations are the federal jurisdiction is shrinking and the state is expanding. I want to just go over how this works in a little bit in some graphic examples here. So the federal jurisdiction includes the navigable waters, the streams. It's going to include some stream tributaries that flow into a navigable water, as long as those tributaries are relatively permanent. So that may include some intermittent streams. It's not going to include ephemeral streams that only flow for short periods. So it may include streams that flow seasonally but dry up during certain times of the year. It's not going to include the ephemeral streams. And then for wetlands, it's only going to include wetlands that have a continuous surface connection to a stream that is covered. So it's hard to tell from these definitions because they're not fully fleshed out yet which wetlands will be included. But like a wetland here that has an actual connection to a stream, that may be included under the federal jurisdiction. These types of wetlands out here are not going to be included under federal jurisdiction. So as I said, the Army Corps of Engineers, which implements the wetlands regulations, they just really don't have all the details at this point. I asked for some more information and they said they're still waiting on guidance. So this kind of remains to be seen how it's all going to play out. I did want to point out that those changes to the federal jurisdiction EPA has estimated that because of the recent change in the regulation that came out in August, they're reducing jurisdiction nationwide over 1 to 5 million miles of ephemeral streams and up to 63% of wetlands by acreage. So a lot of resources are no longer going to be federally jurisdictional. So just to go through Ingrid's example again here in Woodstock, kind of put all of that together. So we talked about the red is the jurisdiction, the New York State regulated streams. The New York State regulated streams are shown here in red, and the New York State regulated wetland right now is just this one wetland shown in red. The federal jurisdiction, it's hard to tell. Some of these streams are probably jurisdictional if they meet that standard of being relatively permanent. And then some of these wetlands are probably jurisdictional if they are have a continuous connection to a stream. But we can't tell from the mapping that we have which ones are jurisdictional. Starting in 2025, again, we're not going to be tied to the map anymore. So this wetland here is 12.4 acres, but it's not on the state maps right now. So that will become jurisdictional in 2025. And then starting in 2028, when the limit goes down to 7.4 acres, these purple circled wetlands will become New York State jurisdictional as well. I wanted to emphasize the point about the permitting. So this is an example of a site that it was proposed for a campground development. And the developer, I guess, saw over here that these are New York State jurisdictional wetlands, and they just decided to stay away from any development in that area. But around this lake, there are some smaller wetlands that are federally jurisdictional. There's a stream here that opens out into a little wetland, and some other wetlands here that were considered possibly federally jurisdictional. But the developer knew that they could easily get those general permits or have access to the general permit to make small crossings of those wetlands, and so went ahead and planned their campsites in that area. So just to zoom in on that area, this is the stream and the kind of the mouth of the stream that are federally jurisdictional. And this is before the development happened, and this is after. So you see that, maybe they only crossed it in a small place, but there was no reason that they couldn't cut down the trees all around the wetland, and basically, whatever habitat value that has a lot less afterwards. So just because something is federally jurisdictional doesn't mean that it has any significant level of protection. Okay, I want to take a few minutes to go through a couple of examples and just make sure that all of this is cemented in everyone's mind. So these examples are from a large site that's proposed for potential development. It's a hill. So this part here is kind of the low flat area that was formerly farm fields. Then it goes up a hill, and in the back part, there's a forested area in the back. And there's a stream corridor that runs through the site here. So just looking first at this orange circled area, you have a stream corridor with a wetlands complex kind of surrounding it. Oops, sorry. There we go. And these wetlands are not, the stream is a perennial mapped stream that's class C, not CT, it's a class C. And the wetlands have not been mapped as a state protected wetland. So if I were doing this in person, I'd ask you to shout out, but I'm just gonna go through it and tell you that, so this stream, because it's a class C, probably would not have any state protection. The wetland complex does not have any state regulation at this time, but it may in 2025 if it's 12.4 acres of wetlands. And As far as federal jurisdiction, the stream probably is federally jurisdictional, and the wetlands connected to it are probably federally jurisdictional. So then the second example is some isolated wetlands in the forest here. These include buttonbush pools, intermittent woodland pools, and intermittent swamps with no connection to a stream. So those are essentially not going to have any state or federal jurisdiction because they're not mapped, they're not 12.4 acres, they're not connected to a stream, they're just isolated and have no state or federal jurisdiction. I'm going to keep moving because I see where the time is flying by. But if you want to look later, there's 2 more examples that you can go through on your own and see if you think they would have state or federal jurisdiction. Okay, and I want to move along to local regulation because the municipalities do have the power to make their own rules to protect streams and wetlands. And as you can see, there are a lot of gaps in the state and federal regulatory structure. And so there are a lot of streams and wetlands that have no jurisdiction, state or federal, and they're not any less important than the ones that do. So things like isolated wetlands and headwater streams often will not have any state or federal jurisdiction, and they may be just as important or more important to the local ecology. The other thing to remember is that those state and federal programs are permitting programs. So even if there is jurisdiction, it doesn't mean that a permit won't be given and construction can still be allowed in those areas. So by adopting local laws, you make the rules. And you do have that authority. Municipalities have authority under New York State Municipal Home Rule Law, Section 10, and also the State Freshwater Wetlands Act specifically says that you can regulate smaller wetlands in your community. So what I always advise people is the first thing I would do is if I were a municipality thinking about how to better regulate streams and wetlands is look at what you already have on the books, because sometimes there are things in people's codes that are not really being applied. And so kind of the low-hanging fruit is just see what you've got and whether it's being implemented by the planning board, whether the planning board is using the tools in your code when it reviews subdivisions and site plans, and using all the available opportunities. And also see if the code is being enforced by code enforcement officers. Sometimes code enforcement is more focused on like building code violations and not things like wetlands. So those are things, if they're not being enforced in your community, that's your low-hanging fruit, your first step. You don't need to get anyone to change the law. And then if you do want to change the law and regulate more resources that are not currently being regulated, consider which resources are important in your community and what the threats are to them. Is it mainly a lot of residential subdivisions happening, or what's going on in your community that you need to address? And also consider the political will. Are you in a place that is going to be anxious to put more stringent regulations on the books or not? And also the enforcement capacity that you have so that you design something that you can get passed and that you can get enforced. So the next few slides, I'm going to go through a few examples of approaches that municipalities can use to regulate streams and wetlands in their community. The first example is just a kind of general all-purpose wetland and watercourse protection law. These laws provide comprehensive regulation of construction as well as other activities like just filling or draining wetlands unrelated to any construction. And the municipality, in creating a wetland and watercourse protection law, designates which streams, wetlands, and what size buffers they want to include in that. The law also includes a permitting process usually, and you can include separate penalties for this law separate from other penalties that might be in your zoning, like you might want to have the site restored to its original condition, for instance. So an example, we've been using the town of Woodstock as an example and showing you how some of the streams and wetlands have state or federal jurisdiction and some don't. The good news is that the town of Woodstock has their own wetland and watercourse protection law. So they have decided that they want to regulate wetlands of all sizes, vernal pools, streams, and water bodies. So those isolated wetlands and the ephemeral streams, those are going to be included in Woodstock's town regulations. They include buffers that vary in size depending on the resource, from 30 to 100 feet. And they require permits for various activities, construction, as well as other impacts to streams and wetlands. And they have a wetland and watercourse inspector who helps to implement that law. And the nice thing about local laws is you can go find them all on eCode. If you just Google eCode and the name of the municipality, you'll find their code. And there's no problem copying someone's law. They're open source. They're free to everyone. So go ahead and find a good one and use it. Some other approaches, if you don't want to do a full-fledged wetland and watercourse protection law, one approach is just putting setbacks in your zoning. So this would apply just to new construction, not necessarily other types of activities. But it might be a kind of a first step if you're not ready to go all the way to a full wetland law. So, for example, in the town of Gardner, what they did was they put that for all DEC regulated streams, so the AAA, B, C, T streams, they regulate a 100-foot buffer beyond the top of the bank. So wherever that bank ends that DEC is regulating, the town puts an additional 100-foot buffer on it. So that's kind of simple. They didn't have to make any maps on their own or anything. They just put that extra 100 feet in. And this is an example where a project was proposed on this old farmland up here. And the DEC bed and banks of the Schwangankill only went up 50 feet. It did go up a little farther in the steep area because it was more than a 45-degree slope, but the actual bed and banks only went up a little way. But then Gardner's regulation added an additional 100 feet that the construction had to stay back from the stream. Another example, another approach is the use of overlay zoning. And I'm going to go through a couple different ways overlay zoning can be used. One way is that if there's specific corridors where you want to regulate development, you could create an overlay zone. So this is the city of Newburgh. What they did was they said that along the Hudson River and along some of the major creeks, so this is the Quasaic Creek, and then up here, there's some other larger creeks. Along those creeks, they wanted to put they wanted to designate a corridor where development in that area would still be governed by the underlying zoning. So if that's a business district or a residential district, it would still be governed by that. But then they put an overlay on it where there are additional requirements to protect the stream in those areas. Another approach of the use of overlay zoning, this is in the town of Newcastle. And in their town, they had a couple of areas, one over here and one over here, that are part of watersheds that drain to drinking water sources. So what they wanted to do was they created an environmental protection overlay in those areas, so that, again, the underlying zoning is whatever density and uses are allowed in those areas, but there are additional protections for wetlands specifically in those areas where they said, we want to give extra attention to wetlands in these areas where we're trying to protect drinking water. Another approach, this is from the town of Pine Plains. Another approach is conservation planning. So you may have heard of conservation subdivisions. The idea is that instead of just laying out a subdivision in the best way or just in a standard format, you start out by looking at the resources on the site and designating which areas should be kept natural before you start putting where the houses will go or the other types of uses will go. So in the town of Pine Plains, in the rural districts, they require the use of conservation subdivision. And they actually don't even want the applicant to come in with a map of where they want their subdivision to be. The first thing the applicant comes in with is a map of the important natural resources. And then the applicant and the board work together to agree to which areas should be kept in conservation before anyone comes in with a map that has any houses on it. So they're really just looking at the natural state of the site without being distracted by the development proposal. And I want to point out this resource. The Department of State has a publication, Model Local Laws to Increase Resilience, and Ingrid will have a link to that later. But some of these examples that I just showed, there are a lot more examples of different types of local laws in this publication, and you can copy them. All right, almost to the end, but I want to talk a little bit about seeker. So I put seeker in the local section because even though it's a state law, it's something that is carried out locally. And this is really an important thing that local boards can do. And especially planning boards. So even if your town board or village board isn't ready to change the law, you as planning board members have the ability to use the seeker process more effectively to protect streams and wetlands. So I want to emphasize that seeker is not limited to regulated resources. I sometimes see that where when people are doing a seeker review, they say, well, we have to look at these wetlands and these streams because they're the regulated ones. That it actually doesn't matter. What you're looking at in seeker is all the environmental resources on the site. And you can use that as an opportunity. What you're looking for in seeker is significant adverse impacts to natural resources. And I always like to tell people to look at those criteria in 6 NYCRR 617.7 that actually talk about what types of resources to look at, because it doesn't ever say that you're only looking at the regulated ones. So if there are streams or wetlands that are unregulated, you can still look at the impacts to those in seeker. One way of making your seeker process more effective is to collect data in advance. So for example, this is some habitat mapping that was done in the town of Hyde Park, where a team of local board members and the group Hudsonia went out and mapped all the habitats in this area. It's kind of the northern part of the town that's mainly undeveloped. And when you have a map like that, then when an application comes in, you have the resources to say, actually, we know which types of wetlands and streams are in this area, and we're going to need you to do some more mapping or some more on the ground study to make sure that they're being protected. Another thing you can do to make your seeker process work better is make sure that you're doing this today by sitting in this session and learning from Ingrid and me, but make sure that the rest of your board members are getting educated, and make sure that you have consultants that have the frame of mind that you want them to have when they're looking at plans for you. And then I also want to point out the use of critical environmental areas. That is an opportunity that municipalities have. You can designate certain areas to be critical environmental areas in your municipality, and that puts on the record the resources that are important in that area, and make sure that in future seeker reviews, those will be looked at. So once you designate a critical environmental area, which your town board can do by resolution, it doesn't need to do a local law, it gets loaded into the state database, and whenever a project is proposed in that area, it'll show up as a critical environmental area. And as you know, that's one of the issues to look at in your part 2 when you're doing seeker. So finally, I want to point out that this isn't kind of situation where you just pick one approach and protect your streams and wetlands that way. You may need to layer different approaches to maximize conservation of those resources. So I would suggest considering conservation at different scales. On a town-wide scale, think about where your town wants to concentrate development and which areas you don't want to have so much development. And in the areas that you want to keep as low density, you can have lower density zoning. You can use overlays. This example is the town of Red Hook, and what they did was they created some areas where there's a lot of farmland, and they made those low density districts. They also created a waterfront district along the river, and then they created high density districts where they're encouraging more growth right adjacent to the village of Red Hook. So I think it's hard to always try to protect resources on an individual site if you haven't done that initial work of as a municipality of saying, where do we want growth to be and what areas are we willing to try to keep a lower density or protect more resources there. At the site scale, you can use conservation design to maximize the environmental protection, and you could consider wetlands and watercourse laws to steer development away from the resources on the site. And then at individual wetland scales, you may, if you're finding that you're having trouble protecting individual wetlands, look at the buffers and setbacks in your code and consider zoning changes for that. So, you may need to kind of use different approaches, use seeker, use local laws to try to keep the best protection you can of those resources that are important to your community. And I just want to highlight too some of the things that planning board members can do. So I mentioned most of these things already, but you can use the local laws that you already have. You can use seeker and make sure that your consultants understand they have the data and the understanding of what you're looking to protect. You can advocate for new local laws with your town board or village board. And if you're reviewing a project and you think that there may be wetlands there, you can ask the applicant to go have their wetland mapping validated by DEC. You can, if you think there may be federally jurisdictional wetlands, ask them to go have a jurisdictional determination from the Army Corps. So you can kind of take that initiative with projects that come before your board. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Ingrid for the last section, and then I think we'll have some time for questions.
Great. Thanks, Emily. I think you need to, there we go. All right. So thanks. The last section here will discuss additional opportunities for training and tools and funding available if you're interested in pursuing local policy in your community. So if you're interested in learning more specifically about the changing state wetland regulations, we will be hosting a webinar on December 14th that will go further in depth on that topic with a staff member from DEC who's been involved on that team. That we were hoping to offer that webinar later this month, and it was postponed because the rulemaking process has been a little bit delayed. So we're hoping this will line up with the public comment period for the draft regulations, and this will be a good opportunity to hear directly from DEC about the proposed changes. In addition, I'll just pitch another workshop we're hosting in 2 weeks with Emily Svenson and Bonnie Franson, who's a planner, about seeker and habitat conservation. And that will be an in-person workshop from 5:30 to 8:30 in Wappingers Falls. And that will also touch on some of the topics that Emily just covered. And lastly, we have a lot of prior webinar recordings on this and similar topics on wetland and headwater stream conservation, mapping, how to use topographic maps and soil maps to try to identify these resources, more in-depth coverage of the habitat values, etc. And those are available on our webinar webpage, which is listed here. And if you're not already on our DEC Delivers email list, you can sign up on that page. There's this DEC Delivers box where you can sign up to receive announcements about upcoming programs and funding opportunities. In addition, the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper is an online interactive mapping tool from the DEC, and it's a useful reference for existing stream and wetland maps. This is showing the wetland mapping that's available, which has the state mapping and the National Wetlands Inventory, and also includes wetland soils information based on soil drainage classification and the hydric status of soils. So we've drew this information out of county soil survey data from NRCS. And so this is a really nice tool to use to view that soil data, which is a good indicator of where you may find additional unmapped wetlands. And there are also different stream maps in this tool as well. Your community may have a natural resources inventory or other local studies that provide additional mapping and data about local streams and wetlands. This is an example of a natural resources inventory from the town of Cornwall in Orange County. And it's a map showing their FEMA flood zones, 100 and 500-year flood zones. But they also gathered information from their highway department about roadways that have been flooding, like that had flooded in the events after Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee 10 years ago. So these inventories often contain additional local information that's valuable. And if you're, you should check if your community has one. And if you don't, our program offers funding and support to develop these types of studies. Emily already touched on the model local laws to increase resilience, and this includes a large chapter on wetland and watercourse protection measures with many examples from New York communities, and I highly recommend this resource. Has a diverse array of different approaches to these types of regulations, and a good overview and discussion. And there's some additional publications we also wanted to include that may be useful, including the Environmental Law Institute's Planner's Guide to Wetland Buffers for Local Governments publication. And in addition, there's a recent study. This blue cover is a study that was put together by the Nature Conservancy and faculty from University of Delaware, where they did in-depth case studies of 3 Hudson Valley communities that have implemented wetland and watercourse protection laws. And lastly, our own website has a lot of different resources and is a clearinghouse for information on conservation planning, including things like conservation overlay zoning. We also put together some fact sheets for this series that we're holding. They're fact sheets on wetland conservation, stream conservation, and a nice overview of these the changing state and federal regulations. And so you can access these through the links provided here. And the slides will be available after the program if you're interested. We can also put these links in to any of these resources in the chat box during the Q&A if you'd like. So if you're interested in developing local policy, there's funding available through Hudson River Estuary grants and also from the Hudson River Valley Greenway. These grants can be used to fund professional assistance for zoning revisions, as well as wetland and watercourse laws or conservation overlay zoning. This is an example of a project for overlay zone in the Indian Brook Croton Gorge watershed area of Westchester that we funded, that's underway. Project between 5 municipalities there to protect drinking water quality and water quality more generally in this area. DEC and Department of Health also offer assistance and funding through the Drinking Water Source Protection Program, which is a locally led, state-supported program that empowers municipalities to take action to improve and protect their public drinking water sources and the surrounding environment. And this program is voluntary and offers free technical assistance to develop and implement drinking water source protection plans. And there's also further assistance and funding for implementing those plans. And the link is on the bottom of the page here. And we also have the Hudson River Estuary Trees for Tribs program, which helps streamside landowners and municipalities that with restoring buffer vegetation along streams. This is an example from up in the Capital District of a project that they undertook. But this is a great opportunity both for municipalities and streamside landowners, and we can always use assistance with getting the word out that you can get free trees and shrubs and help with planting them to restore stream buffers. Once again, our take-home messages, we hope you're coming away from this webinar with a better understanding about the importance of wetlands and streams and associated buffer areas for clean water and many other benefits. Remember that our existing maps are incomplete, and hopefully you can take a close look and look out for these resources in the projects you're reviewing. The state and federal regulations are changing, and there are some big gaps, but municipalities can do more. And thank you for taking the time to join us and for all the work you are doing to make a difference. So we're happy to answer questions now, and there will also be a brief evaluation available through a link in the chat box, and we'll send that out in the after the follow-up email as well. We appreciate any feedback on this program. We are offering it in a few other locations, and always interested in any feedback you have. Thank you, and thanks again to our hosts, and thank you to Emily for your excellent presentation.
I would say thank you both very much. That was extremely informative with lots of great links and resources. I mean, these slides are going to be invaluable. We do have a few questions in the Q&A. If you'd like, I'll just read them out. One, there is a planned unit development for 79 acres with 180 residential units on property that has extensive wetlands and streams flowing into Swan Lake waters that flow into the, I'm not sure if it's a typo or if I'm mispronouncing it, Magump in Delaware River Basin. The question is, how are these state and federal wetlands delineated, since the site map from the developer doesn't identify them by number?
So I'll try to take a stab at that one. So normally what happens is the developer, the applicant, has their own consultant go out and delineate the wetland and produce a map of that. They flag the wetland and produce a map. And again, the state wetlands, they would need to be mapped and by New York State as jurisdictional. But then once they're mapped by New York State, they actually, the actual delineation, the borders of it are determined in the field. So the developer's consultant would go out and flag and map those wetlands. And then if they are state jurisdictional, if they are currently regulated by the state, which means they would have to be on the state map, then DEC can go out there and validate the mapping that the applicant provides. And if they are federally jurisdictional wetlands, then the Army Corps can issue a jurisdictional determination based on the mapping that the developer provides. And I'm not sure what the number has to do with it. So if it's a state mapped wetland, it will have a number associated with it. And that should be identified, but the key is that they provide it to DEC to validate the mapping.
Okay. Next question is, hi, can you provide or point to up-to-date data about wetlands? How much were there at the first Euro settlement? How much has been lost statewide, nationwide? I've seen wild estimates and I'm wondering if there's dependable data and sources. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I can try to answer that. As I pointed out in the presentation, the existing wetland mapping is incomplete. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has put out some fact sheets about states and wetland coverage. I don't know exactly when they were published, but I've seen a statistic that it's estimated that 60% of New York's wetland coverage has been lost since European settlement. I don't know how they came to that number, what analysis it was based on. New York State did an assessment of wetland status and trends back in the late 1990s. And that report is still available on the DEC website. It's really interesting. And I think it also included that statistic from EPA, from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and noted how, large areas of wetlands were drained for agriculture, for example. In the past, many of those areas have been abandoned from agricultural use. We have more wetlands recovering in some parts of the state, in particular out in Western New York. But that's not the case here in the Hudson Valley, where we still are, at least at that point in time, we're documented to be losing wetlands. The other thing I wanted to note is, and I forgot to mention in the presentation, DEC is actually working on remapping wetlands. So the regulatory changes mean that they will no longer be linked to a jurisdictional map, but the state is working with Cornell to create new informational maps that will hopefully provide a better depiction of wetland coverage. And but those won't be out, I think, until 2025, probably, when the regulations go in effect.
Okay. Next question is, what is New York and the DEC doing to address PFAS from entering into our water system, i.e. wetlands and streams?
Yeah,
Ingrid? I go ahead.
I can't answer that question, and I would refer you to contact DEC Region 3. I'm not involved in that work. I know the agency is very involved in addressing PFAS contamination, but I don't know specifically about this issue with wetlands and streams.
Yeah, I'm not up to date enough on it either to speak to that. Sorry.
Yeah, can't get everything. I mean, I'm sure everyone here should be very impressed at you for how you answered previous questions. So don't expect you to have everything at the tip of your fingers. So someone else said, fabulous presentation. Thank you. This was a very informative lecture. The presenters were articulate and knowledgeable. This could be presented to high school students as well. Thank you very much. So no question. Great presentation, very comprehensive, lots of resource information. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. How do the new regs define unusual importance for the purpose of designating a wetland?
Yeah, that one I can take a try at. So the just to make sure we're crystal clear, the state adopted a change to the statute that makes some changes to the law that will then need to be implemented by regulation, and those regulations are still under development, and that's what will be coming out for public comment within the next several months. And so we don't have the specific regulations yet, but I can tell you what was in the statute that will then get translated into the regulations in more detail. Some of the criteria were wetlands that are in a watershed where flooding is a problem. wetlands that are in an urban area or adjacent to an urban area, wetlands that provide habitat for protected species, and specifically vernal pools are considered an unusual importance. So those are some of the criteria. And I would suggest keeping an eye out for the regulation when it comes out for comment and taking part in that process.
Okay. Another question is, will landowners face any repercussions if there are new regulations? Such as, will a community be required to install a sewer system and get on a sewer line and off septic systems?
The regulations we've been speaking about are only related to physical disturbance of streams and wetlands. So it mainly impacts development and construction in general. As far as runoff or those types of issues, that's different from what we've been talking about. So I don't want to go too far into that right now.
Okay. All right. This is interesting. Are farmers generally in favor of wetlands and stream regulations because they protect their water resource, or are they against government regulations of their personal property?
A lot of these laws are written so that they have minimal impact on agriculture. That tends to be a state priority, that we understand that farming is essential and that we try not to impact it too much. So I'm not sure I'm sure different farmers have different opinions on regulation. Farmers are stewards of the land and take care of it. But at the same time, of course, excess red tape can make things difficult. So I would say, though, that most of these laws do have exemptions for agriculture.
Another question is, would streams, I don't know the class, that run underground, because A, in some cases they have always run below ground, and B, others have been filled and built upon, are either of these types of water courses covered by any of the laws? Some of these waterways are running underground and do feed into major streams.
I don't know about you, Ingrid, but I have not personally seen, and anyone else can chime in, but I have not seen completely piped waterways mapped as any kind of regulated streams.
I haven't come across that, and I'm not, yeah, I feel like that's a good question. So I don't know the answer to that, but I presume they're probably not jurisdictional under these regulations. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, there can certainly be value in seeking to daylight those streams and return them to a more natural condition. But I'm not aware of specific regulation.
I think I have seen instances in which something was at least mapped as wetlands at some point, and at some point it got the stream that created it was put underground. So the maps are showing wetlands happening over what on the surface is fairly dry ground. But I have no idea when these things happen. So all right. If we go out and map wetlands and streams, will this information be used to update the maps online?
I'm not sure which maps. There's so many different maps online. I will note that there is a provision in the New York State, the updated New York State statute, that says that the state will accept information from municipalities and others with information about wetlands in the development of their programs. So again, keep an eye out for those the comment period on the new regulations.
Is there anything on the federal level? I mean, if something goes, if wetlands are mapped and Army Corps issues a jurisdictional letter, is there a a map that gets updated somewhere that upon that
I don't believe
issuance?
so. That would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah, this is a question that's come up over many programs we've held, I think, and it would be so valuable if we could gather this information and update our maps. But it seems nobody has figured out how to make that happen.
Okay, we got another thank you for your helpful answer to a previous question. Another one. In Ingrid's first presentation, you showed a channel filled with rocks with no vegetation on either side. How does this impact flooding issues?
Yeah, I was looking at that question. I'm trying to recall exactly which slide it's referring to, but I mean, in general, having an intact network of streams both helps because those streams are able to carry water, but there's also some level of infiltration, some level of spreading out the water that occurs, versus when streams are channelized or buried, it just results in that water being removed off the landscape much more quickly, so that it's reaching larger streams and rivers and resulting in a bigger flood. Also, when you have a stream that does have vegetation adjacent to it, it's able to, that buffer area can intercept the runoff that's coming into the stream, slow it down, reduce erosion. There is some infiltration that can occur there too. But sorry for the confusing slide, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, generally streams want to have access to their floodplains, right? So they can slow down and spread out and not cause downstream flooding. So I'm kind of envisioning something that's been incised and hardened, and that's not going to be as good at maintaining the hydrology.
All right. I think this is a response to a question we answered. I've seen those 1990s and earlier reports. Thank you. I'll just assume they are the best info available. I think that was from the question about the overall loss of wetlands. I'm not 100% sure though.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for this informative presentation. Thank you. Very informative. Great presentation. Thanks. This has been a great webinar. Unfortunately, I missed the first part. When will it be on the site? There will be the Rockland Municipal Planning Federation has a YouTube channel, so I can post this video. I think you guys at DEC also have some webinars online.
Yeah, we'll be offering this program as a webinar again on November 9th at 1 o'clock. And we're doing this as a webinar on Monday evening with Dutchess and Ulster County Planning Federation groups.
Okay.
Yeah, there is one question in the chat too that we could touch on from Kate about when issuing a wetland permit, could state law mandate recreation of damaged or destroyed wetlands ×2? Maybe she's referring to both state or a local law, I guess. But I have come across examples of local laws that require some compensation for damaged wetlands or lost wetlands. Emily, do you want to touch on that?
Sure. Yeah, it's a really important point, and I'm glad that it was mentioned. So yeah, when there's a decision that a permit needs to be issued to alter a wetland, there can be a requirement for compensatory mitigation, which could include enlarging an existing wetland. It could include creating a new wetland, either on-site or off-site, or restoring a degraded wetland. So there are all different ways of doing that. I mean, I think it's important to remember that it's not that easy to just create a wetland, because you need to have the right hydrology, the right soils. And so sometimes created wetlands are not as effective as natural ones. And I think that's why sometimes there's a request to make the new wetland, the mitigation wetland, larger than what was destroyed, so that you have a better chance of recreating those ecosystem services. So I think that's what they're getting at. Both state and federal regulations can require compensatory mitigation.
All right. I just want to point out, since we are hitting 7:30, I'm happy to stay on and keep going with some questions, but I did put in the chat a link to the survey that DEC would ask people to fill out so they can get feedback. This same link will be in your automatic post attendance email, which you'll get tomorrow. So you could do the survey tonight, or you could do it tomorrow as well. But I wanted to get that out there before we hit 7:30.
I'm afraid I am going to have to go, but I'd be happy to have people contact me. You have my contact information here. So if there's anything that wasn't clear or follow-up questions, feel free to reach out.
Okay, well, I'm sorry you have to go, but thank you very much for your time tonight. Thank you also, Ingrid. I appreciate it. I also, you also said this at the beginning. Thank you for everyone for being here. Not only are you giving up your time tonight, most of you are board members or otherwise involved in your community. So thank you very much for the time that you donate every night or other nights, I should say, to making your community a better place. I don't know if Ingrid, if you want to try to fly solo for a little bit, or if you want to say goodnight, but thank you, Emily, for coming on, and I understand that if you have to go, that's fine.
Yeah, I have tickets to a show, so I've got to run, but thank you so much. And I would be glad to answer anything offline. Good night.
Okay. Thank you. Good night.
Bye, Emily. Sure, I'm happy to try to answer the last few questions.
Okay.
I can. I won't know. I don't know if I can answer all of them, but yeah, following up on the question about karst waterways, I would say, Hillary, actually maybe follow up with me, because I'm curious to reach out to our Bureau of Ecosystem Health staff to ask about these situations. I'm guessing that these waterways, unless they're only flowing briefly underground, that they probably wouldn't be covered by the Protection of Waters program. But I don't know if there any other regulations would apply from the state, at least.
And there was also a question: can regulations include a requirement by a landowner to keep a stream clear of debris buildup?
I have seen examples of that type of regulation in local laws. So I think that is possible.
Okay. All right, and we have a few people saying thank you, thank you, thank you. I would reiterate that sentiment, so thank you very much. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A section. So with that, I think perhaps we could let you go. Like I said, everyone should be getting an email tomorrow with confirmation. If people want to get the slides, you can shoot me an email. I think I put in the chat earlier, but I'll do it again right now.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks again to everybody for listening. And feel free to follow up with me as well if I can help answer additional questions.
All right. All right. So that will call it a night. And thank you very much, Ingrid. I'll be in touch. And best of luck with your upcoming webinars. I'll be putting out some messages on my email list. So people, I probably annoy quite a lot with all the messages I send out, but they'll hear more about other opportunities that you're providing.
Great. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, and good night, everyone.
Good night.